And we are officially recording. So welcome How to Jumpstart Your Blog or Podcast with Erin Coughlin. And I'm really excited to learn a little bit more because I really want to do a blog. Although a podcast seems a little scary to me, but I'd still like to learn about it too.
That's great. I'm glad to hear you're excited about it. Yeah, a lot of people sometimes think that blogging and podcasting are very different things to do. They're actually not. A lot of the same rules of, I hate to say, basic journalism 101 apply to being a good podcaster or blogger. And we're going to go over a whole bunch of different ways and different tricks and tips that you can use, that professionals such as myself use when they're out in the field to enhance their blogs and make their podcast and their blog come across as professional. And we're going to discover different ways that you can create content for your blog or podcast. If anyone is comfortable, I love, especially in the beginning, if anyone is actually working on a blog or a podcast, please feel free to go ahead right now and unmute yourself and just let us know if you have started a podcast, you have a podcast or a blog, or are you just starting out and you're looking to get started and you would like some help. So if anyone would like to volunteer to go first, please feel free. If anyone is a little bit shy, that's quite okay. Just put in the comment, that you don't necessarily want to participate like that, and we'll get started. Okay, if you're a little shy about talking about your endeavor to start blogging or podcasting, that's okay. And as we had mentioned before, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat section, and we'll have a Q&A at the end where we'll open it up for everyone to ask their questions and find out some more information. So welcome, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight on How to Jumpstart Your Blog or Podcast. My name is Erin Coughlin, and I am actually a writer-producer, and I've created content for various podcasts and publications. And on this slide here, you can see where some of my previous work has appeared. It's a lot of fun getting to produce content for different forms of media, whether it is a digital online publication or a podcast. It is definitely something, if you're interested in doing it and you start to get into it, you'll definitely find out pretty quickly and early on in the process whether this is something for you. And you definitely, when it does go right, you definitely get to enjoy the perks of starting your podcast or blog. So in tonight's workshop, we're going to discuss a couple of different key issues that can apply to both podcasting and blogging. I apologize in advance because the emphasis is a lot on podcasting, if you see the slides, but the rules, it's basic journalism 101. The rules for a good podcast apply to having a good blog. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about, a little bit about journalism and what it means to actually produce your own blog or podcast. We're going to go over just a very brief overview of the different ethics and responsibilities that you do have as a journalist, because essentially whether you're blogging about something or you're podcasting it and people are listening to you versus just reading your content, you do have different responsibilities when you accept that role or position. We're going to also go over some professional tips and tricks that you can use to become not just a stronger content producer, and we're going to address what an actual content producer is in more detail, but what it means to become a stronger interviewer or a show host if you're podcasting. And we're going to also go over how you can create memorable content by using the skills and the connections that you already have that you might have overlooked. A lot of people, when they're getting started, or you kind of have a blank slate and you're not quite sure, how do I get started? Is this a crazy idea or whatnot? And what do I do? So we're going to address things that you can do to utilize the skills and your connections with other people to help you get started and feel more comfortable doing it. And then we're going to also, excuse me, talk about how you can increase your online platform So that's something like your websites and your social media presence, and how you can incorporate that into your podcast to make it stronger and better, and also to reach your audience and the people you want to connect to. So the role of a content producer, a journalist, or a reporter is, the main goal is to create what we would call honest, insightful, engaging, or entertaining content. And before we get started, I'm just going to explain, because some people are like, what's a content producer? A content producer is basically just an industry term that professionals use for when you, let's put it this way, you come up with an idea for something, you write down your notes, you outline it, and then you actually put it together and you publish it either online as a blog or you do it as a podcast. Producing is when you go out and you basically create the story and you share it with others. That's the role of a producer. So it's just a fancy word for saying a storyteller or a reporter or a journalist, but they all mean the same thing. So our first area that we're going to discuss is getting started with your podcast or your blog and trying to figure out what sort of topics are you going to write about or what your specialty is going to be. First thing you want to consider when you're choosing your podcast or your blog name is you want to pick something that's easy for people to remember. So it's easy for them to access and remember to go back to it. Something that's easy for them to look up online. You want to consider things like SEO, which is called search engine optimization, and you want it to be keyword friendly. So if someone who is looking for the kind of content you're producing but doesn't necessarily know about your podcast yet or your blog, they enter certain words into, say, Google, and your podcast will come up or your blog will come up as something that would be of interest to them, because you've used different descriptive words that they used when they were looking for you or searching for you online. And you also want to make sure that whatever name you choose for your blog or your podcast is something that clearly identifies what sort of subject matter or content you're going to provide or comment on. And one of the first aspects of coming up with what your content is going to be is you want to consider who or what you're branding. What is it that you want people to associate with your blog or your podcast? And there's two different approaches you can take when it comes to branding or creating a public image for yourself or your podcast or blog. If you look on the slide I'm using some examples of actually podcasts that I've run in the past. The Galabout was what we would call an example of an alternative persona or a mask when it comes to content production. That's when you're using a different identity or it's just an alternative personality for yourself to represent your content, so that it's not necessarily you, they're not necessarily knowing you by your first and last name. It's sort of a personality you can kind of hide behind or use to be associated with. Whereas the other alternative is when you actually use your own name because you want to be known as yourself and not as sort of like an iconic image. So for a couple of years, I went and under my programming, I called it the Galabout. That was the name of both my blog and my podcast. And the great thing about blogging and podcasting is you're not limited to just doing one over the other. When I started out with a basic blog or a website, and eventually I got interested in doing and producing video content and audio content to go with it. And that's where I incorporated a blog with my podcast. There are two different mediums which provided two different forms of content, but it all had the same subject matter or topical interest. And over the years, I decided to, because I became more comfortable with my background and my experience with creating content, I decided to go a slightly different and more professional sounding way to me. And I shed the gallop out and just decided it's from now on, my podcast is going to be called With Erin Cotlin, because I was at that point where I was ready for people to associate my content with who I was professionally. So that question is up to you, what you feel more comfortable with. If you want to start with that fun, kind of gimmicky alternative persona, then go for it. If you want people to know you for who you are and what kind of content you are creating, then try to incorporate your name. You see a lot of very famous talk show hosts, the name of their show has their name in it because they want people to associate who they are with the actual show that they're branding. So it's really up to you what you feel comfortable doing and where you think you eventually want your blog or podcast to go. And one of the best ways to actually help you focus on your blog or podcast is to embrace your niche. And a niche is content that relates to or appeals to a very specific demographic or group of people. Some people have very specific interests in different types of movies. So maybe there's, a blog or a podcast for people who love horror films. Or maybe there's a blog or a podcast that's just movies in general. But you need to find the one area or specialty that you enjoy the most writing about or podcasting about. And the reasons why it's important to lean more into a niche, if you can, is because sometimes when you're trying to cover too much content, you're trying to create too broad of a subject matter for your blog or your podcast, you're going to feel, especially if you're just starting out, you might feel overwhelmed or unfocused by it because you are trying to please so many people at once and try to gather so many different followers that it's going to be hard to focus on creating content that's really good content. And so instead of appealing to a larger audience and a larger base of people, you might want to consider picking a niche because it'll help you focus on getting more loyal, stronger fan base, so to speak. Okay. So I like to use examples of fellow podcasters and bloggers that I know when I talk to everyone about this subject matter. And my friend McCall and Jessica actually have a blog called The Test. And their niche is more feminist based. Their niche is films by women, and they take a different approach to their film blog and podcast. Their approach is, if anyone's familiar with the Bechdel test, it's a test that can be applied to, say, films or books. And their specialty is discussing how women are represented on film or on the page and discussing different female storytellers. So that's their niche. They're trying to appeal to an audience that's interested in that sort of subject matter. And if you're looking for a good example of, say, a movie podcast that's more broad in their area of expertise and their area of content, you have something like the Films on Tap podcast, which focuses on a wider range of films. And their fan base is not as specialized as, say, Jessica and McCall's. Okay, and the premise of their podcast and blog, as you can see, is it's a group of male friends who get together once a week and talk about their love of movies and all the new movies that are coming out that they get to watch and discuss together. So those are two different examples of what we would call a niche, but different approaches to their specialty. And the only way you're going to get better at something is to actually, in this case, listen to it or read it. Write down, if you need to, think about the things that you're passionate about or that interest you the most. And you're going to want to try to find different podcasts or blogs that are tailored to those interests and that are tailored to the kinds of content that you think you want to write or produce. And listen to them and read what they have to say. and find out how they're doing it and see what their content's like. And a great reason to do this is because you'll find out, as a viewer or a listener or a reader, you'll find out what resonates with you. What kind of content do you enjoy? What kind of content do you not enjoy? What kind of content do you you don't want to produce versus the kind of content that you think sounds exciting and fun and is definitely something you're interested in. Okay. So when you're thinking about your podcast or blog, you want to think of your brand statement, which is basically, what does your blog or podcast stand for? Okay. And some of the ways you can think about this are by addressing the things that we mentioned on the slide, such as what does your podcast or blog stand for? What do you believe in? What kind of content do you find valuable or aspire to produce? What are the things that interest you and that you want to contribute to the world or to your listeners or readers? And what kind of content or message do you want your followers or your readers to associate with your blog or podcast? What do you want people to get out of their experience every time they read something that you've posted or listen to something that you've published? And what is your podcast's goal or aim? Some people start podcasts and blogs just because they need a creative outlet. And others start blogs and podcasts because maybe they're looking to break into that in the job market. They want to see what it's like to be a professional storyteller or journalist. So figuring out and knowing what you want to do ahead of time with your blog or your podcast will definitely help you stay focused as you try to create the actual content for your blog or podcast. So for some different examples of branding and your company message, when I had the Gal About Town or the Gal About, I personally like content that's very straightforward, that has, it doesn't go off point. Everything has the same ideal behind it. So one of my first logos was that we served our news the way we liked our whiskey: hard, straight, no junk in it, which means you weren't going to find stupid fluff pieces. You were going to find things that were more insightful, more engaging, that went behind the scenes to what other people were creating. And you weren't going to get stories and different subject matter that wasn't related to what we were promising to provide for our listeners and our readers. And then when I decided to switch from the Gal About, and I underwent some changes with my own blog and podcast, I decided, I do like creating content that is uncensored, uncut, and unreserved. I like for my guests on my podcast and my blog to have a chance to really discuss the things that they are passionate about without me interrupting them or editing the conversation to fit an agenda. I wanted the podcast and my blog to be about what they had to say and how they felt about different things. So I decided to rehaul everything and make my main focus. It's a bit different, a little bit different, not much, but my logo and my brand, I purposely designed it to represent the kind of attitude and the values that I wanted my audience to associate with what I was creating. So deciding on something like this, what do you stand for? And what sort of experience do you want your audience to walk away from, or your readers to walk away from your blog with? It's going to help you stay focused on figuring out what kind of content you want to create. Do you want to create evergreen pieces, which is content that will always be in style or always be of interest to people? Or do you want to create something that's a bit more timely? And you'll also figure out how to reach and appeal and engage to people who are reading or listening to your blog or podcast. So in order to uncover what your blog or podcasting superpower is going to be, that's what are you really good at, or what are you really passionate about? You want to think about things like that. Because if you're really passionate about your subject matter, it's going to be easier for you to constantly create new content for it, right? Because you're interested in and invested in what you're doing. And you also want to think about your connections and how you can utilize different aspects of your own life to keep creating content and to also appeal to other people. In the beginning, when you're podcasting especially, or setting out a blog, the one advantage for setting up a blog is it's a bit cheaper than podcasting equipment when we're talking about software and equipment. But in the beginning, whether you're setting up a blog or a podcast, you're most likely going to have to pay all the expenses upfront by yourself. And this is where you get to say to everyone, I'm a producer, because you're putting up the money to fund your dream project. So in the beginning, you're most likely going to have to pay for everything out of pocket. And that's including everything from, and this even applies to if you're creating a blog, you're going to want to look at things like recording and editing equipment or software. Whether you're having a podcast or a blog or both, you're going to want to look into a server or a hosting platform, someplace where you can actually publish your content to. And you're also going to take into account the idea of any sort of travel expenses or fees to get into events. If you're interviewing someone for a story, you might have to actually, to make your guest comfortable, you might want to buy them a drink to help them kind of relax. If you're looking to cover an event, you're going to at first have to probably fit the bill just to get into the event to cover it. But luckily, it's not expensive to get started. So if you're interested in the podcasting aspect, equipment that you're going to want to look into is something like professional quality microphones. You don't have to get expensive microphones when you're just starting out, especially even if you're just creating content for a blog and you want to record any interviews or any notes that you have. You don't have to spend a lot of money to get something that works great. I always encourage video cameras, sound and video editing software, and I think we all can agree you're going to need a computer, a tablet, or some sort of mobile device that you can create your content on. But luckily, you can get all of this and it's not going to run you a crazy amount of money when you're just starting out. And at the end, I actually have software and some equipment that I'll show you that was not expensive, but that you can get to use when you're just starting out with everything. When it comes to blogging, it's going to be a lot of the same rules apply as if you were having a podcast. You're going to need a platform or a website, someplace where you can publish your podcast to, your blog to, where people can subscribe to your blog as well. And you're going to need, obviously, something to type up your blog on. So for anyone who's interested in the podcasting aspect, this is just a couple of examples of some editing software and some hosting apps and platforms that you're going to want to look into, because even though you record and edit your podcast, you're still going to have to upload it to a server to store it so that people can go and actually listen to your podcast. If you're looking more into getting started with blogging, you're going to want to look into something like WordPress, where you can regularly write and post your blog, and people will have easy access to it online at the same time that programs and servers like WordPress will archive your writing, so you don't have to worry about backlogging it. It'll automatically be saved after you publish it. It'll automatically save it to your website so you can access it if you need to again. And I personally, when it comes to podcasting, I've been very happy using SoundCloud to store and share my podcast episodes. So as we had mentioned before, in the beginning, you're most likely going to have to spend your own money to produce your blog or your podcast. Another alternative, something that you can look into the more you get into actually creating your content and you're ready to invest more of your time and money into it and really make a go of it, is you can consider things like fundraising and sponsorships. And that's when you have other companies pay to advertise or fund your blog or podcast. One of the things you can do, especially when you're starting out, that you might want to look into, is to add what we call a donation button to your website. And you can show your followers or your readers that you're using the money they donate to fund all your podcast or blog expenses, produce the actual content for social media or for the blog or podcast. You can use that money to secure and produce guest spots for either. And you can use the money to gain admittance to cover live events where you are going to create the live content that you're going to share with them. And it's also a great opportunity. You can create in-person and virtual events where your followers get to engage with you and your guest. So those are just some things to consider if you're thinking of going full time with it. If it's not just a hobby and it's something you want to try to do to bring in an extra income or passive income, you're definitely eventually going to want to think of fundraising, sponsorship, or getting donations. And the first step if you're thinking of going that route, is sponsors will come if they see that you have a strong audience. So when you're starting out, you want to build your audience first and get those loyal followers to tune in every week or read your posts every time that you publish something. And then you will be able to appeal to sponsors because they know you have a following and they know that they have people who are going to be interested in return visiting the website or the podcast, and they'll see it as a good investment for them as well. So as I mentioned before, it really doesn't matter how fancy or expensive your equipment is. Your content is the most important aspect of your blog or your podcast. If you can produce, it doesn't have to be even long segments of fresh content. If you can produce good content that other people enjoy, that's all that really matters. So don't get hung up on spending a lot of money on fancy equipment. Especially if you're just starting out, you don't need to. And focus on creating content that you're proud of or that you care about. And people will follow. You will find people who are interested in what you're producing. So one of the things you do want to do in the beginning when you're starting out is you want to establish your online presence. You want people to know who you are and what you're doing. So the first thing I would always suggest is you want to create a logo, something that your audience members or your readers can associate with your blog or podcast. And I always tell everyone, you want to create a logo that looks good, one logo that looks good in black and white, and one logo that looks good in color, because you never know where your logo might end up. If it ends up in print, it might look better in black and white. And if it's digital, of course, you can obviously use color. But you always want your logo to stand out and be a strong image and a symbol for what your blog or podcast is or what it's about. Okay. You want to also make sure that you use your logo and the different design elements that you use on your blog or your podcast. You want to use that like across the board. You want to use that on your social media channels, including things like your Facebook page or your Twitter account. You want everyone to be able to know that that's your page and they associate it with you no matter which channel they're looking at. Another thing you want to do is, especially as you're starting to take it more serious and you're starting to invest more in it, is you want to get a domain name. That's a web address that is specifically designated just for your blog or podcast. Okay, you want to try to keep things separate. If you want to have that one landing page, that one website that they type in that address and they go to exactly what you want to see. And you're also going to want to create a separate email account that is just for everything that you do under your podcast or blog name. And we're going to talk more about correspondence and why that's important in a little bit. So one thing you can do when you're setting up a blog or podcast, as we mentioned, social media is very important. You want to set up a social media channel that's designated just for your podcast content or your blog content. So that's something like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. You want to get your specific social media handle that is designated or represents your blog or podcast. And a lot of people, when I even see professionals who overlook this, and one of the things you want to definitely invest in is your profile biography on your social media accounts. You want to make sure in your biography, the top part of your social media page, you want to make sure that your readers and your audience is familiar with certain information. So in your profile introduction, things you want to include would include your contact information in case someone wants to get in touch with you or wants to get a hold of you. You never know who's looking at your work. So you want someone who's enjoying your work, or maybe they're a sponsor, or maybe they're a media outlet who's interested in covering or interviewing you. You want to make sure that they are able to get a hold of you easily. So always have your contact information, like your email address, your domain name, in your intro section at the top of your social media channel or social media page. And of course, you're going to want to include a link to your website or your podcast. Okay. So as you can see on the slide up top, I went with my professional name, what I go with professionally. If you can, you want to use your logo that you just created, or you want to use a professional or a very nice looking headshot of yourself in your profile. Okay. You want to encourage people to reach out to you and get in touch with you. So definitely have, as you can see, you want to make sure that your email address is prominent so that someone can just click on it so they can get in touch with you if they are interested in talking to you more. And if you have any other relevant links besides just your website or your blog or podcast domain, if you have any other relevant links, you want to include that in your profile description as well. So it will entice people to click on it and to check that out. And you also want to make sure that your user ID name, whatever social media handle that you're using, you want to make sure that it's either the same name as your blog or podcast, or that it clearly represents you. So that's just an example of what my Twitter handle looks like at the top of my Twitter page, right? So when you're on things like Facebook and you have a Facebook page, you have a cover photo section. You want to use that cover photo section to maximize the information you're relaying to people who land on your social media channel or your social media page. So in that area, include any relevant information about your blog, your podcast, or even yourself in that section. And in your profile section, you also want to include keywords, links, or contact information that applies to your blog or podcast that's important as well. You want it to always be easy for other people to find you and make contact with you. So why is social media so important, especially to bloggers and podcasters? It's important because you get to engage with your followers through social media, and you get to find out what sort of content you're producing that they like, what sort of content they might want to see more of. You also get to increase how you engage with them on social media. And a lot of times it's great, use social media to give them a behind the scenes look at how you create your podcast or blog, or if you're interviewing someone for your podcast or blog. People love to see that behind the scenes extra, or those cutting room floor moments of how something is created. So that's definitely one way that you can reach out to them and you can gain more traction with your blog or podcast. And you also want people, you're creating your blog or your podcast, and you want them to be able to share it with people they think would be interested in it. So social media is the #1 way to get people to share the things that they're enjoying. So you always want to maximize social media as much as possible. Let people know what you're doing and what you're creating. And if you're ever going to be out, whether it's for a blog or a podcast, if you're ever going to be out hosting an event, attending an event, going to an author signing, going to a film festival, you want to let your audience or your readers know that you're actually going to be there and that you're going to be covering that event. So social media is a great way to give your listeners or your audience or your readers advance notice as to where they can find you socially, in person, or even if you're doing something virtually. You give them a heads up as to what you're doing so they can engage with you and also read your content or listen to your content and participate. Definitely, if you're blogging, obviously you're going to want to set up a website. If you're podcasting, I would definitely encourage you to create at least a one-page website, which includes your logo, your brand message. What brand message is basically just a way of saying, what's my content going to be about, and what do we want you to get from this experience? On a website, you can use it as an opportunity to share a schedule of any of your upcoming podcast episodes, any guests who might be appearing on your podcast, or any events you might be attending. If it's for a blog, it's a great opportunity to give them a highlight of maybe something that you're going to be writing about next week, so they can get excited about it, or give a heads up to their friends and family who they think would be interested in it. You're going to also include embeds or links to where your followers or listeners or readers can check out your work and actually listen to it or read it. And that's where we mentioned earlier, you're going to include something like a donation button if you're trying to raise money to continue funding and producing your own content. And one of the most important things that sometimes gets overlooked is what we call a subscription form, or the RSS feed. And that's so that your readers or your audience can subscribe to your blog or podcast. So whenever you do post something, whether it's written or it's a video or an audio file, they will get advanced notice, and it's the VIP treatment. They'll know about it before everyone else does. It'll go straight to their mobile device or their inbox, and they'll know right away when they can log on and they can read it or listen to it. So should your podcast have a newsletter? Should your blog have a newsletter? I'm a big fan of newsletters because I think it's a great way to connect with your readers and your listeners outside of what you're blogging or podcasting about. It's, as we had mentioned, it's just like social media. It's another tool that you can use to connect with your audience and to give them a heads up if you're covering an event or if you have an event coming up. If you have a special guest or someone you're excited about interviewing for your podcast or your blog, you can share that information with them and they'll know to keep an eye out for it. And it's also another great tool to use to try to find out what sort of content are they enjoying and how are they reacting to what you are producing. If you are, especially if you're going to apply to try to cover live events, you're definitely going to want to have some inexpensive business cards made up, at least in the beginning. You don't have to spend a fortune, but try to have some sort of business card on you with your information. And that includes, of course, your blog or podcast name, your contact information, and where they can read or listen to you. And you're going to want to keep that on you at all times, because you never know when you're out someplace whether you're going to be able to connect with a future listener or reader, or someone who's able to help you produce new interesting content, or land that interview with someone that you've always wanted to interview with, but you didn't know how to go about approaching them. You never know who someone you run into might know, or what opportunity will become available to you. So having a business card or some sort of information that you can share and give to other people will go a long way it will help out in helping you create content. So how do you actually create content? There's different ways, and we're going to go over some professional tips and tricks on how you can actually land that interview or access to an event that you're excited about. So there's different types of content and different forms of content that you should be aware of. The first is what we call featured content. And this is longer formatted content that focuses on, say, one specific single story, an individual, a group, or an event. Whereas a segment is a much shorter piece. And those are usually shorter interviews. And like if you think of the Today Show, they have a lot of different segments. They're usually anywhere from about 30 seconds to maybe 2 minutes long. That's a segment. That's just a short snippet that you've created. And it usually ties into the overall message or subject matter of your blog or podcast. Evergreen content is content that is always useful or of interest to your readers or your audience. It's something that 5 months from now someone might look it up and still be interested in. Okay. Whereas viral content is content that is it's kind of on the spur of the moment, and its purpose is to be continuously shared by anyone who receives it and sort of passed on. So now the question is, what are you going to do when it comes to your blog or your podcast? You can have a blog that has both video and audio, as well as editorial, which is written, anything that's like a written story. You can go and have a blog that's just complete video, or video and audio. It really is up to you and what you're comfortable with, what your interests are. You can combine everything, or you could decide, you're going to stick with something that's a written blog, and you're not comfortable maybe with the video editing and audio elements of it. So you'll just stick with the editorial version, and that's fine. It's all about where you're comfortable working, what you're comfortable working with. So start out, I usually say, start out with one and try to branch out. If you want to go for trying to cover everything, that's great too. Whatever, the most important thing is that you're creating new content and that you're posting it regularly. That's the key to everything. Now, there's different approaches, especially to podcasting, and it also applies when you're thinking about a blog. Is what is the feel or tone of what you're creating? Are you going for something that's conversational, where it comes across where you're having just what it sounds like, a normal casual conversation with someone? Or are you going for a more formal approach, where maybe you're behind a desk, or you're sitting at a desk of some kind in a designated studio type environment, and it's not as laid back, right? It's more like what we would see on like the evening news. So discovering your approach to how you're going to create content really boils down to your personality and what works best for you. But no matter which approach you decide on, the rules are going to apply evenly to both formats. So the pitch is a 1 to 2 sentence description that includes the subject of your podcast or blog and why it's relevant or important, why the person or event that you're writing about or podcasting about will appeal to your followers, and what your followers and subject will get out of participating in your blog or podcast. So remember, especially when you're starting out, if it interests you, chances are there will be other people out there who are interested in the same exact subjects. So don't worry about, who's going to listen to my podcast about this particular subject matter. There's always an audience out there. So just do what you're passionate about and what you care about. And I'm sure you will find other people who want to listen to or read your work. And the important goal is you always want to make sure that the people who are either appearing on your podcast or in some way contributing to your blog, and to the people who are reading or listening to your work, you always want to make sure that they feel like they're getting a return on the investment of their time, because they are investing their time in what you're working on. And so you always want them to walk away feeling like they were glad that they tuned in or that they read what you wrote. So how do you get started when you're just starting out? If I'm sure everyone's familiar with the phrase, write what you know, which means basically just start with what you're comfortable with, start with what you're familiar with or what interests you. And I mean, how many times have you heard, if you're interested in something and you really care about what you're doing, you're going to keep doing it, right? And you're going to be excited about it. And other people are going to see that excitement and they're going to be attracted to it. And they're going to want to check out your blog or podcast. So the first steps that you can take is you want to think about your local connections or local events. And you want to approach those opportunities first, because most likely you're more comfortable with them. So start locally when you're starting your blog or podcast when it comes to looking for content. If you're the kind who enjoys volunteering, you might want to try volunteering to work at local events or to help someone else, because that could open the door for you to create some sort of content based on that experience. And definitely tell your friends and family what you're working on. Tell your friends and family you're starting a blog or a podcast, because you never know if someone that you've told that information to might be in a position to, or might know someone who can help you create the kind of content that you're interested in. A couple of years ago, I had a great opportunity. I was working for a new publication, and I told some friends and family that I was working for a new publication and what sort of content we were looking for. And I got lucky. Someone I told that to, just in a normal conversation at a barbecue, turned around and told me that they knew the producer and head writer of the film Birdman, which went on to win 4 Oscars, I believe. And I was able to land an interview with one of my favorite film directors and a screenwriter that I admired. So you never know, by mentioning to other people what your interests are, you never know if someone might be in a position to actually help you create that content that you want. And it doesn't have to be something as big as interviewing an Oscar winner. It could be something as simple as interviewing someone who is maybe your local hero, or someone who has a local business that you think is incredible and other people should know about. So don't underestimate those opportunities. If you're creating a blog or podcast, you're definitely going to want to look into getting guests for your blog or podcast. And we're going to discuss, how do you approach and book getting someone onto your blog or podcast? It's actually a lot easier than you might think. So the first thing you can do is you can reach out to people using their official websites. A lot of people on their websites know to have their contact information. So if they catch someone's interest, they'll reach out to them. So always check someone's official website. Say you want to interview a best-selling author. Visit their website. There's probably going to be, under press or contact information, some way for you to reach out and get in touch with them, or at least their publicist, and try to get that interview. You can also try using Facebook or your social media channels. If there's someone within a reasonable distance, you could try approaching them in person or visiting the venue itself. And most cases, if you're trying to interview a more popular or public figure, you're going to have to go through their publicists or like a PR or press department. And you can really find everything online. So say you're interested in interviewing Captain America, Chris Evans. You can look up online Chris Evans' representation and reach out to them and try to get that interview. You never know. They might give you the green light and say, they're ready to talk. Call us up anytime. So those are some ways for you to get started. I would suggest building your way up to talking to publicists and PR departments by work your way up to it. Get comfortable so that when you go to approach someone who you think is that unreachable star, you're more comfortable in how you approach them. And I always say the key to communication, to approaching anyone as a guest speaker or even trying to get admission to an event is what I call HAT. It's hello, ask, and thank. H is for hello. Whenever you send out a message to someone trying to get them interested in participating in your blog or podcast, you always want to start off. It sounds like it's so simple, but you'd be amazed how many people kind of just launch into discussing what their podcast or their blog is about, that they forget to just simply say hi. So always start off with a friendly greeting and just try to be as personable and professional as you can. Then you're going to ask, you're going to inquire after how that person is doing. And then you're going to thank them. You're always going to make sure when you end your messages that you thank the person for their time and their assistance, whether you ever hear from them or not. You always want to make sure that they feel appreciated. So the first time you reach out to someone, you're going to try to tailor. It's like when you're having a conversation on the phone, right? With someone you don't quite know so well. You want to always try to tailor your message to each individual guest or subject. And, if you have to practice it, practice it. If it takes 1,000 drafts of an email, that's what it takes. But you want to try to sound human. Don't sound robotic. You want to be approachable, right? Explain who you are. Talk about your blog. If you have a background that gives credit to what your blog or your podcast is about, you definitely want to let them know. So you want to let them know why should you be the person to conduct the interview or cover an event. And also show them that you're familiar with their background or their work, or if it's an event venue or event space, show them that you're familiar with what they do and that you didn't just randomly decide to get in touch with them, but prove to them that through your research and your knowledge of them, you know that they are the perfect subject for your blog or podcast. And you can do this by throwing in specific examples of their business or projects, things that they've worked on. You want to show them that you've done your background check, and you're familiar with who they are. So give them a couple of examples proving this to them, that you do know who they are and why you think, because you know who they are, what their work is or what they're affiliated with, why they would be great for your blog or podcast. You also want to mention, because a lot of times it's not just about why should they help you, but what are they going to get out of it by appearing on your blog or podcast? And you're going to want to use this as an opportunity to explain why they are the ideal person to speak with. What is it about their business or their project or their background that makes them perfect for your readers or your audience? And always, emphasize what advantage they have to appearing on your blog or podcast and what the advantages of them appearing on your blog or podcast is to your audience. You can also include your social media followers or describe your reputation in the community if it helps to increase your chances of them wanting to talk with you more. And so on this next slide, I included an email that I wrote to a roboticist out in Seattle when I was covering a story for NBC Sci-Fi. And as you can see from the beginning, friendly greeting. Yeah, you explain who you are, what your blog or podcast is about, why you're appealing to them to let them interview you, and why you think not just would it be of benefit to that person, the person you're writing to, but what would your audience or your readers get out of that experience? And then, of course, you're encouraging them to get in touch with you when it's most convenient. And always remember at the bottom, always include your contact information, including your blog or podcast domain, your website, or a link where they can listen to previous episodes or read previous blog posts so that they become familiar with your work as well. So how do you get to cover events? There's different ways that you can start trying to approach events. And hopefully when things go back to normal, you will be able to enjoy this part of podcasting and blogging, because it's a lot of fun when you get to actually go out there and meet the people who interest you, and also meet the people who are reading or listening to your work. So one way to start getting invited to events is to start out at local events, places where maybe you know someone or it's easier for you to have access to getting into. And then you can branch your way out as you get more comfortable trying to cover an event. Because believe me, when you first start covering an event, it can be a bit nerve-wracking because you're nervous about doing a good job. Maybe you're not comfortable yet talking to people that you don't know. So gradually you're going to want to build up on that skill. And utilize your connections. If you know someone who's running an interesting event or doing something that's related to your blog or podcast, you definitely want to reach out to those connections first, because sometimes it's just easier to start with people we're familiar with or we're comfortable with. If you're applying to something like Comic-Con or Film Festival or Book Expo, you're going to most likely, you can go to the website for the event. Every event has a professional website that you can go to. And on most of those websites, you have to actually fill out an application. And the application is really just you explaining who you are, why you're the best person to cover this event, what you're covering the event for, who you're covering it for, who's your audience, and what are the benefits that both the event will have from being featured on your blog or podcast, and how will that increase their standing with your audience. And that's where having even just the one-page website and podcast samples or your previous blogging samples available will come in handy. Because when you apply to these events, on most applications they ask for links to your previous work or your current samples, so they can see you in action and get a better understanding and familiarity with what your blog or podcast is about. And as we had mentioned before, never underestimate the people that you know. Let people that you know that you're interested in covering events, and you might be surprised. Someone might be able to help get access to something that interests you or that you think would be great for your blog or podcast. And, you know, it's another opportunity that you won't want to pass on. Before attending any event, you're going to want to confirm your appointment or your access to the event at least 3 days beforehand. And whether you're blogging or podcasting, you're going to want to make sure that all of your equipment is working, everything is set up, and that you have a backup plan. I can't tell you how many times I've been out covering a story or an event, and you think, you know, your app or your camera or your microphone is going to be great and everything's going to work fine. And then you show up and there's no reception, and suddenly you can't take that photo for social media, or your microphone it just doesn't work and it's not friendly, and you have to resort to your backup plan. So you always want to make sure that everything works as best as it can, and you always want to have an alternative solution in case something does go wrong. And you also want to let your followers on social media know that you're going to be covering the event. It feels really good actually when when you go out somewhere and you hear from someone who approaches you, they recognize you from your blog or your podcast, and they come up and they say hi. It feels really good, especially after you put in all that work to create that content, to see that people are appreciating it, and you get to see it in person, or you get to hear back from them. So those are some things you want to take care of before you actually go to cover an event. And when you're at the event, of course, you're going to want to arrive early to make sure that one, you can get in, and you're going to want to follow any instructions that they've given you beforehand on how to get into the actual event. So you want to make sure first you can get in the door okay. You're going to follow the same professional guidelines for blogging and podcasting as before that you would with any story, no matter what the story is. You're going to definitely want to take plenty of video footage and photos that you can share on your social media, because I can't tell you enough how much people love seeing that kind of stuff on social media. It's a behind the scenes exclusive privilege that a lot of people enjoy when you share that on social media, and they will engage with you when they see it. So you'll get to reach out to your audience and find out more about them. If you have anything that strictly like that kind of identifies you, if you want to be identified by people at the event, if you have a t-shirt with your podcast name on it, if you have a hat with your blog name on it, then people can spot you, that's great. Anything that makes you stand out like that and might capture interest from people, they might want to talk to you. Especially if you're covering an event, you're going to want to talk to the people who are actually at the event, the fans, people who are there who might just be attendees. So it's a great way to get people to feel comfortable talking to you as well. Sometimes if you're covering an event, you might want to go covertly. You might not want people to know that you're, say, covering a food festival, because you want to be able to sneak in there and write your reviews and kind of go under the radar. And that's okay too. And before you leave any event, whether it's virtual or real, you do want to thank the person who invited you to cover the event. So if you can seek them out, if it's in person, try to find them and thank them. Thank them before you leave, and let them know that you appreciated the opportunity to be there. Whether you're interviewing someone or writing about something, you always want to make sure when it regards collaborating with someone else, whether it's a venue or an individual, you always want to send a follow-up thank you letter to the person who helped you gain admittance, or who helped set up the interview. Okay. Always tag them and thank them in your social media. Let them know ahead of time, if you can, where and when you're going to post your blog or podcast. Or a lot of the times, especially with blogging software and blogging servers, you can pre-schedule your posts. So if you know in advance when you're going to actually set it to publish your blog or podcast, you want to share that information with them ahead of time so that they know, one, when it's going to be up, and two, how they can share it on their own social media accounts as well. And you always want to make sure that you include your relevant podcast link or blogging link with them, and any other information that could be of use to them, reading or listening to that content or sharing it with others. And if anyone is not familiar with, there's the basic rules of journalism are the simple questions that you need to ask. It's who, what, why, where, when, and how. Those are the questions you always want to be asking, especially when you interview someone and you're getting the story. So who's the event? Who are you interviewing? Or what is the event? What is taking place? If you're interviewing a person, what have they accomplished? What's the reason that you're interviewing them? Why are you interviewing them, or why are you covering an event? You always want to let people know where you are, where the event is, and put together your blog or your podcast as if it were a real news story. So the different steps that you can take before recording your actual podcast or publishing your blog post are very important as well. You can, if you're blogging, you can write stuff that's on the spur of the moment. Most times, especially if you're going to try to continuously post your blog or podcast, you're going to want to try to plan things out the way a professional content producer would. You're going to want to think a couple of months in advance to what your content might be. And one of the things you can do is you can create a content calendar where you basically just list what your stories are going to be, or who your guests are going to be. And you're going to create a list of the people and events that you want to blog or podcast about. And you're going to want to, once you've made a list of who you want to include in your podcast or what you want to write about, you're going to approach those actual individuals or those venues ahead of time, so you can set up your interview. And you're going to want to confirm once they've agreed to everything and given you the okay, you're just going to want to confirm your interview or confirm that you're going to be admitted into an event. The most important thing about blogging and podcasting is that you want it to be something that you do on a regular basis. If you post like once every couple of weeks, you are going to probably lose traction with your readers or your audience. So the more you post and the more you engage with your audience, the more likely they're going to keep coming back, and your podcast or your blog will gain traction and gain notice. So the most important thing is to try to figure out what is like a good day or a good time for you to post your content. You want to keep it very steady and continuous. People want to know that, like, when they wake up on Monday, there's a new story, right? So that's the best way to increase your followers and to also gain attention from potential sponsors. 2 weeks before your podcast recording or your story, you're going to want to make sure that you've researched your guest or you've done your research. You're going to want to write down some questions or write down your questions about the person you're interviewing. You're going to want to make sure, especially if you're going through official channels like a publicist or a PR rep, you're going to want to make sure that you've acquired any sort of media from them ahead of time that you can use in your blog or podcast. And when we say media acquisition, we mean any images or video footage of that person or of that event that you plan on using in your blog or podcast. And once you gain that media from them, you're going to, in your blog and podcast, you're always going to want to give credit to the source material. Whoever took that photo and video, you're going to want to give them credit in your blog or podcast. Confirm the call or appointment. Make sure that you're still good to go and they're still ready to talk to you. And you're also going to want to start sharing on your social media what your upcoming schedule is and who your guest appearances are going to be, what events you're going to cover over the next couple of weeks, so that you can get your followers excited about the kind of content you're producing. And you also give them enough notice to, if you're, say, attending an event, you've given them enough notice to know that they can attend that event or you'll be at that event, and that they can share it ahead of time with anyone they think would be interested in it. And of course, always test out your equipment, your podcast, and make sure your blog is working. A lot of times you'll notice you'll be writing something and there's a glitch in the software. So you always want to make sure that everything is working the way it should be. 3 days before your recording or your story or your interview, you want to sort and organize all of your notes and any sort of questions that you have, especially if you're conducting an interview. Retest all of your equipment. Again, make sure everything is working and that you have access to it. If you're going to be at a venue, you want to just confirm and double check that the venue is prepared for you to stop by. And of course, you're going to want to, if you're on camera especially, you're going to want to try to pick an outfit ahead of time and set up your workstation or interview station, and make backup plans in case something goes wrong or it doesn't go the way you're planning. So especially this applies to podcasting. Before the actual recording, or if you're doing a blog entry and you're interviewing someone and you're recording your conversation, things you're going to want to make sure of is that your appearance is professional. Mute all your notifications, so in the middle of your writing or your recording, you're not getting any of those disruptive little emojis coming across your screen and diverting your attention away from your subject. Keep a drink handy, stay hydrated, and always have your questions and your notes in front of you, just in case you need them. So the structure of a podcast segment is very similar to the structure of a blog entry. But we're going to address specifically right now the structure of a podcast. So the initial step is you have the setup, making sure that everything works, your workspace or your recording space is clean and everything's functional. You're going to test your equipment. Then you're going to do off-air introductions. This is where you greet your guest or you speak to the person who's invited you to the venue. Then you're going to do on-air introductions where you introduce your guest. Then there's the actual interview or feature section of your story. And then, of course, you're always going to want to thank your subject. And you're going to close out with a statement. And we're going to look at those in a little bit more detail. If you're working on a blog, it's basically the same rules as if you were doing a podcast. You make sure you have all of your notes, everything that you need is handy. You would start like your paragraph off. It's your opening paragraph with a hook. You would introduce what your story is going to be about, what your blog post is about, and you're going to try to catch your reader's attention right away. Then you're going to give them the bulk of the story and what's important. And then you are always going to you would always thank your readers for reading your blog, and you're going to remind them of some important information that they need to know. So we're just going to go over what I would call your podcast formula for success. And this can apply to the same situation if you were interviewing someone for your blog as well as your podcast. If you're doing a podcast, you're going to want to try to have some sort of introductory theme music. If you have Apple, there's some different little snippets of some sound snippets and sound bites that you can use to introduce your podcast. If you're a musician and you want to create your own introduction, go for it. So your initial greeting is going to include your podcast name and your social media channels. And you're going to thank your audience for tuning in or for reading your blog. You're going to thank them for showing up. You're going to then politely announce and introduce who your guest is. And that's, of course, it's going to include their name, where your listeners might recognize them from, their most recent or current projects or accomplishments, and why you've invited them to appear on your podcast. You're going to follow this up by warmly greeting your guest and thanking them for appearing on your podcast. That's when you're going to initiate your interview or footage and have the bulk of your conversation. Remember, especially if you're doing video, especially if you're doing a video podcast or just a video blog, you're going to want to remember to always include your logo, your website name, and any important social media handles and contact information on the bottom of your screen during the course of the video to constantly kind of remind them what they're listening to and how they can continue listening to it or get in touch with you. You're also going to show this information at the very end of your video. And if you ever break up your video blog or your podcast into segments, you're going to want to mention it at the beginning and end of your video between any breaks. Okay. The wrap up is where you mention your guest project, their business, or their product again, to remind everyone why that person was on your video blog or podcast. You're going to invite your guest to mention any sort of important contact information that they want to share with your audience and any information regarding their appearance on the show. And that could be information about their business, their product, or some sort of project they're working on that they want you to be aware of. If you know what your future guests on the show are going to be, that's a great opportunity to entice your audience members to join you next time. So include that information if you can. And also include any other relevant information about your podcast, including how they can subscribe to your podcast or video blog and keep in touch with you. So there's some tips that you can remember that will make the process easier for you, as well as help you come across more professional, and will definitely go a long way if you remember them. My golden rule is what I call, it's not about you. Unless you are blogging really about yourself. Most podcasts and most blogs are about your subject, whether it's a venue or a person. And when I say it's not about you, is if I'm not sure if any of you can think of when you watch TV and you see the show host, and the show host is constantly interrupting their guests, cutting them off, not really letting them speak, right? They're not showing them that sense of courtesy. You don't want to be that person, especially if you're doing a video or a blogging podcast. You want your guests to feel valued. You want to let them finish the conversation, finish their sentence. So give them space and give them the time that they need to finish their thoughts when you're interviewing them. It's not about hearing yourself speak. It's about hearing what they have to say. So be a good listener, and just always remember to extend that courtesy towards them. You also don't want to talk down to other people. Most people don't like that feeling. You want to make your followers and your audience, you want to make them feel special and valued. And if you talk down to them, they're going to tune out very quickly. So make them feel like they're a part of your journey. And you'll definitely get your followers to keep tuning in each week or for each post. Okay. If you are interviewing someone, you always want to make your guests on your blog or your podcast feel comfortable, because a comfortable guest opens up to you. They will talk to you about more than someone who feels threatened or uncomfortable. So if you can, go out of your way to make them feel appreciated, right? Whenever you do get messages, especially from someone like a publicist or someone who works in PR, you're going to want to respond to messages as promptly as you can. It doesn't mean you have to be at their beck and call, but when you see a message, try to get back to them at a reasonable and respectable time, because you are asking for their time and you are asking them to invest in your podcast or your blog. So you want to show them that you appreciate their reaching out to you or getting back to you. And as we had said, showing gratitude towards your followers, your audience, and your guests will go a long way. If people feel comfortable with you and feel that you provided you valued their time and you appreciated what they had to say, they will talk to you again. They will want to come back and appear on your blog or podcast. And the next time you want to talk to them, they'll probably be quicker to respond to you because you did such a great job making them feel appreciated and comfortable. And of course, always send a follow-up letter. Always thank someone for their time. Always thank them for appearing on your blog or podcast, and always offer to keep in touch with them. Okay. So as we had mentioned, always make the people you interview or you collaborate with, even if it's somebody who just helped you get into an event or introduced you to someone that you interviewed, right? You always want to make sure that the people that help you feel appreciated for the fact that they've helped you or they've spent time with you. You want to offer to keep in touch with them and invite them to keep in touch with you. And this can be something as simple as saying, well, if you have a new movie coming out, or if you have anything else that you're working on that you feel, my audience would love to know about, or that you would like to share, or that you care about, invite them to send that information to you in the future and to let you know what they're working on. Definitely participate and follow their social media. You definitely want to build that sense of trust between your subject matter and yourself, that you're there for each other and you mutually will help one another out. And as soon as you know, as we had mentioned before, as soon as you know when you're posting your blog post or your podcast, you want to give them a heads up so they know about it, so they know to keep an eye out for it, and so that they can also share it with anyone they feel it's relevant to. And let's see. And so there are, I mean, there are a lot of great journalists out there. I've put on this, I believe this is the last slide. I've put a list of some journalists that I personally admired over my career. And if anyone's interested, I can send you links so you can actually see them in action as they're interviewing someone or covering an event. But those are just some names of some journalists that I really appreciate and that inspired me in my own work. So I'll include in the chat section, I'm going to, in a second, I will post a link so you can sign up for my newsletter, because I frequently work with ComSwag. We create different programs, and I'd love to see you there again. So if you would like, you just have to click on the link that I'll post in a second, and you can sign up for my newsletter. As you can tell, I'm a fan of newsletters. And that way, if ComSwag and I are working on any new classes or presentations, you'll be one of the first to know, and you can sign up in advance for it. And in addition to information about events, I also will post links to new interviews and other content that I think might be of interest to you. So I encourage everyone to do that. Let me get you the link so you can. Let me get you that link. Okay, so the link in the chat is the link you can click on to subscribe to my newsletter. And we can open it up to any question and answers if anyone wants to talk about anything. I also have, I can show you some of the equipment that I always recommend. Okay. For anyone who's interested in, especially the podcasting element, you don't have to get expensive equipment to successfully cover your story or interview someone. I also recommend this equipment to someone who's setting up a blog. I know video blogging is very big right now, and it's a lot of fun to kind of incorporate everything. So some of my examples here is, you can see this. This is a Shure, it's the MV5. I love portable equipment because that way you can podcast from anywhere you want and cover your story and you get the same quality. So that is a portable microphone that actually detaches. And once it's detached, you'll see it's literally just a ball like that, and it sits flat on any surface that you want, and it records great. The sound quality is wonderful. It works with even programs like GarageBand. You don't need to have something fancy like Pro Tools to get your recording down. And you can even hook it up to your iPhone if you want to, and the recording quality will be perfect even for video. I saw that we had a question. Okay, I see your question. I'll get to that in a sec. Another piece of equipment is, I'm sure anyone who's familiar with like selfie sticks, something like a tripod stand for your iPhone or your iPad device is another way, another great way to cover a story or introduce someone on the go. And you can also get small, I mean, this is a microphone that produces professional quality sound, and it's not expensive. You can get it on Amazon. If you have Amazon Prime, you'll get it in like 2 days. But it's just a simple mic that you plug into your iPhone. And as small and tiny as that is, it produces and picks up professional quality sound. So if you're the kind of vlogger or blogger who's recording an interview that you're going to put into editorial, even something as simple as this goes a long way, tool-wise. And so there was a question, let me see. Writing a story, any tips on writing a storytelling article that is sponsored? Uh, Helen, can you give me a little more information about the article that's sponsored? If you can give me a little more information, I can address that in a little more detail for you. What do you mean by a storytelling article? Okay, well, most likely if it's sponsored, then you're probably going to have to mention who's sponsoring it.
I was going to say, if anybody would like to unmute themselves and ask a question, feel free to.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so a sponsored article that is written from a storytelling perspective. Oh, that's a good one.
Oh, it looks like our host just dropped off by accident. Erin, she might try to come back in. I don't know what happened. Not quite sure why she fell off. What I'll do right now is I'm going to stop the recording